The dry Texas heat pressed down like a physical weight the moment Tasha Meriwether stepped out of her aging sedan. Gravel crunched, a sharp, unwelcoming sound under her worn boots, echoing the arid landscape of Pflugerville. Before her lay the shooting range, a flat expanse of baked earth and distant, shimmering targets under a relentless sun. It looked brittle, unforgiving, much like the air itself, thin and tasting faintly of dust. Tasha clutched her modest gear bag tighter, its familiar weight a small anchor in this unfamiliar territory. She took a moment, adjusting the strap on her shoulder, her gaze sweeping the area. Rough wooden benches lined the sparse shade near the sign-in shack. A scattering of men occupied them, figures etched in faded denim, worn work shirts, and ubiquitous ball caps pulled low. They leaned back, nursing drinks from dented thermoses, the low murmur of their conversation punctuated by rough laughter and the thin blue trails of cigarette smoke curling into the blinding sky. Tasha felt it instantly, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way conversations didn't quite stop but seemed to pause, hanging in the air before resuming a beat later. Eyes slid towards her, lingered for a fraction of a second too long on her dark skin, her simple jeans, her unassuming bag, then flicked away with practiced indifference. At 42, Tasha was fluent in the language of unspoken judgment. She'd navigated enough rooms, lecture halls, hospital wards, PDA meetings, to recognize the invisible walls that went up when she entered certain spaces. This wasn't new. Being one of only 3 black women in her entire nursing program years ago had forged a certain resilience in her, taught her the necessary art of squaring her shoulders, lifting her chin, and moving forward as if the scrutiny didn't touch her. She hadn't driven out here seeking validation or friendship. This time, this space, was for her, a way to reconnect with something steady within herself, something her grandfather had instilled in her long ago on his farm down near Bastrop. Still, despite the practiced resolve, an unwelcome flicker of nerves danced in her stomach. It was the feeling of being outnumbered, out of place, the solitary note in a dissonant chord. Steeling herself, she walked towards the sign-in desk, a simple wooden counter baking in the sun. The man behind it was tall, his face a roadmap of sun exposure, cheeks burnt red beneath the impenetrable shield of mirrored sunglasses. He barely glanced up as she approached, his posture radiating a bored disinterest that felt almost like a dismissal. "First-timer?" His voice was as dry as the dusty ground, the question flat, his eyes flicking over her again, lingering on her non-tactical clothing and the plainness of her gear. The assessment was clear. Tourist. Doesn't belong. "No," Tasha replied, her voice calm and even. She offered a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just haven't been to this range before." He grunted, scribbled something illegible on a clipboard sheet, then jerked a thumb towards the firing lanes further down. "Lane assignments posted. Rules are on the board. Keep it safe." Not another word. No welcome, no direction, just the bare minimum. Tasha signed her name. Tasha Meriwether, in neat, careful script, the pen digging slightly into the paper. She deliberately chose a station at the far end, seeking a small buffer of space from the main cluster of men near the benches. Their low chuckle still reached her, carried on the hot breeze. She caught a fragment. "City folks think they can shoot," followed by another burst of laughter. She ignored it, focusing on the ritual. Unzipping her bag, she laid out her gear with practiced precision. Her pistol, a simple, reliable 9mm. Nothing flashy, no custom grips or elaborate sights, but meticulously cleaned, oiled, and maintained with a kind of care born from respect for the tool. Beside it, a small cardboard box of ammunition, rounds arranged like soldiers in their plastic tray. She pulled the padded ear muffs over her ears, the sudden muffling of the outside world a welcome relief, allowing the internal noise to quieten too. She took her stance, feet planted firmly, knees slightly bent. The familiar pose grounded her. In the quiet space created by the ear muffs, she heard her grandfather's voice, a low, calm rumble from decades past, echoing across the fields of his farm. Steady hands, steady heart, baby girl. Breathe slow. Don't let nothing rush you. Even without looking, she could feel the weight of eyes on her back. Silent, amused, waiting for the inevitable flinch, the fumbled reload, the proof that their assumptions were correct. But Tasha wasn't performing. She'd shed that need long ago. This was about muscle memory, focus, and the quiet satisfaction of a well-executed task. She squared her shoulders again, consciously relaxing the tension that had crept into her neck. Her gaze locked onto the paper target hanging limply at the end of the lane. Its stark black rings a familiar challenge. She hadn't fired a single shot, yet her heart was pounding, a heavy drumbeat against her ribs. Not from fear, precisely, but from the thick, expectant silence that had gathered around her station. It pressed in like humidity, heavy and uncomfortable, charged with unspoken skepticism. A few lanes over, a couple of guys made a deliberate show of loading their rifles, the metallic clatter unnecessarily loud, performative. One called out to his buddy, his voice carrying easily, clearly meant to be overheard. $100 says she flinches on the first shot. Tasha didn't turn, didn't react. Her movements remained deliberate, economical. She loaded the magazine, the click of each round seating firmly a small, satisfying sound. She slid the magazine into the pistol grip until it locked with a solid thunk. Racked the slide, a sharp, clean clack that cut through the air, momentarily silencing the low laughter behind her. Set her feet again, took one long, slow, centering breath, held it, and raised the pistol, both hands forming a firm, practiced grip. No one was laughing now. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw heads turning fully in her direction. Some faces still held smug grins, anticipating failure. Others leaned back, arms crossed, postures radiating bored entertainment, waiting for the show. But Tasha hadn't come here to entertain. She'd come to anchor herself, to hear the clean report of the shot, to feel the controlled power in her hands, to remember the lessons of focus and discipline her grandfather had taught her. And maybe, just maybe, if they were actually watching, she'd remind them that skill doesn't wear a uniform or fit a stereotype. The trigger hadn't broken yet. The air hung thick with anticipation. What happened next wouldn't just be a shot. It would be an answer. And everyone on that range was about to remember Tasha Meriwether's name. The crack of the first shot was sharp, clean, slicing through the heavy air like a whip. For a heartbeat, absolute silence reigned. Conversations died mid-syllable. Somewhere down the line, a metal thermos clattered loudly as it slipped from someone's grasp onto the dusty ground. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. Tasha lowered the pistol slowly, her arms absorbing the controlled recoil, her muscles already anticipating the next movement. She didn't need to squint at the target, but she glanced downrange anyway, a small, internal confirmation. Dead center, a neat, precise hole punched exactly through the bull's eye. Undeniable. The range officer, the impassive man with the mirrored sunglasses, had lifted his head fully now. His sunglasses still hid his eyes, but his mouth was parted slightly, a sliver of surprise showing. He stood motionless for a long moment. Then, from the far end of the benches, a low, drawn-out whistle cut through the silence. It was followed immediately by a muttered, gravelly, "Well, damn." Tasha ejected the spent casing, a tiny brass arc glinting in the sun, and began reloading with practiced, unhurried movements, deliberately keeping her expression neutral, acting as if she hadn't heard the reactions. But she felt the shift. It was palpable, like a tide slowly pulling back, dragging assumptions and preconceived notions out with it. Some of the men turned back to their own gear, suddenly engrossed in cleaning a barrel or adjusting a sight. But their shoulders were stiff now, their movements lacking their earlier casualness. Others stared openly, their amusement replaced by something else. Narrowed eyes, crossed arms betraying not mockery, but a grudging curiosity. Perhaps even the dawning of respect. But not everyone was convinced. A small knot of 3 men, huddled together near the middle lanes, were still resistant. Tasha could hear their low chuckles, saw the dismissive shakes of their heads. Fluke, one of them, a wiry man with greasy hair peeking from under a low-pulled cap, grunted just loud enough to carry. Anybody can get lucky once. A tiny smile touched the corners of Tasha's mouth, tight with patience. Lucky? After thousands of rounds with Grandpa? Okay. She reset her stance, ignoring the comment, her focus narrowing again onto the paper target. Block out the noise. Breathe. Squeeze. Crack. Another sharp report. Another hole appearing almost instantaneously, kissing the edge of the first one. Dead center. Crack. The third shot, overlapping the first 2. Crack. The fourth, deepening the ragged black tear precisely in the heart of the target. The paper target swayed almost imperceptibly with each impact. Tasha didn't rush. Her breathing remained even measured. Her hands were rock-steady, her body relaxed but perfectly anchored. Each shot was a deliberate, controlled punctuation mark. By the time she lowered her pistol after emptying the magazine, the entire front line of shooters was engaged in the awkward dance of pretending not to watch her and failing miserably. Glances slid her way, lingered, then darted back to their own lanes. The silence was broken by the man closest to her station, a heavy-set guy whose bright orange hunting vest seemed too warm for the day, his thick beard damp with sweat. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out a little too loud, betraying a hint of nervousness. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? Tasha carefully placed her pistol on the bench beside her ammo box. She pulled off her ear muffs, letting them hang loosely around her neck, the sudden return of ambient sound almost jarring. She turned and met his gaze squarely, her expression calm. "My grandfather," she said simply, "started teaching me on his farm when I was about 12. The bearded man, Roy, she'd later learn his name was, shifted his weight, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. Well, hell, he mumbled, looking back at her target, then at her. Guess he taught you right. A few others nearby murmured quiet agreement, offering reluctant nods. The tide had definitely turned for most of them. Each shot seemed to land with more weight than just the impact on paper. It felt like punctuation, like a slow, reluctant unlocking of doors that, for her, usually remained firmly bolted. As she methodically worked through her magazine, she caught snippets of conversation drifting from behind her. The tones hushed but audible now. Damn, she's good. Real good. Better'n half the regulars here easy. A short, slightly embarrassed laugh followed that one. Hell, better'n me, that's for damn sure. She noticed the wiry man, Buck, the one who'd issued the rifle challenge, wasn't saying a word now. He was furiously disassembling his own rifle, his attention fiercely focused on the small bolts and springs, a meticulous concentration that screamed avoidance. He wouldn't meet her eye, wouldn't even glance towards her lane. Tasha didn't acknowledge his silent retreat. No gloating smile, no triumphant glance. She simply kept moving, calm, efficient measured, just like Grandpa taught her. White palms on jeans, more habit than necessity, her hands were steady. Reload, breathe, focus, fire. Her mind flickered briefly, inevitably, to her kids. Jordan, 16 now, already towering over her, all lanky limbs and teenage moods. And Mia, just turned 9, with her bright, curious eyes and insistence on sleeping with the glow-in-the-dark star still stuck to her ceiling. Tasha pictured their faces. She wanted them to see this version of her one day. Not just mom who packed lunches and enforced bedtimes, but the woman who stood her ground, who didn't shrink or falter, even when the air crackled with discomfort and unspoken hostility. Crack! Another perfect bullseye. An older man down the line, his weathered face framed by gray hair curling out from under a faded trucker cap, finally broke the focused silence with a direct question. "Ma'am, you teach classes?" he called out, his voice carrying easily, a blend of genuine curiosity and maybe a touch of humor. Tasha paused her reloading, smiling slightly without looking up from her task. "No, sir," she replied, her voice clear. "Just learned to listen good when my grandpa was talking." A ripple of quiet laughter followed, different this time. Not mocking or dismissive, but appreciative, respectful. For the first time since she'd arrived, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere around her seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter, more breathable. The invisible walls hadn't crumbled entirely, but significant cracks had appeared. Men started talking more freely amongst themselves, but now the comments were different. Questions flew back and forth, directed vaguely towards her or discussed nearby. Speculation about her training, the brand of ammo she preferred. A few even offered sheepish admissions of their own struggles with accuracy. Moments of shared vulnerability surfacing in the wake of her undeniable skill. It wasn't a sudden embrace into their fold, not perfectly smooth. Some faces remained skeptical, stiff with the kind of ingrained pride that resists acknowledging when it's wrong. But the ice had definitely broken, and for today, that felt like enough. Tasha carefully lowered her weapon one last time, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and set the pistol aside on its case. She had driven out here bracing herself for a lonely, potentially miserable afternoon. She'd expected judgment, and she'd certainly received it. But it hadn't lasted. Skill talks. Patience talks louder. And grace under fire? That speaks volumes, drowning out the whispers and erasing the sideways glances. But she sensed it wasn't quite over. Not everyone lets go of their first impressions easily. The real test, she suspected, wasn't just hitting the target, but navigating the aftermath. The acrid tang of gunpowder hung thick and heavy in the late afternoon air, a familiar perfume now mingling with the dust. Tasha methodically packed her pistol back into its simple case, the movements deliberate, calming. She could feel the change around her wasn't just curiosity or grudging admiration anymore. It was something deeper, harder to define. A tangible shift in the collective weight of the place. But equality wasn't granted easily. The wiry man, Buck, still hadn't truly processed his defeat. He kept shooting tight, sideways glances her way as he aggressively reloaded his rifle, his hands fidgeting, clumsy in their haste. It was painfully clear that losing face, being shown up so thoroughly in front of the others, had burrowed deep under his skin, festering like a splinter. Tasha zipped her gear bag slowly, deliberately staying quiet. There was no need to rub salt in the wound. His own pride was doing that job well enough. But neither was she going to shrink or apologize for her competence just to soothe his bruised ego. Suddenly, Buck snapped. He slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle with unnecessary force, the sound jarringly loud. He strode aggressively into the lane directly beside hers, practically crowding her space. "You think you're better than everybody here?" he barked, his voice sharp-edged, raw with resentment, louder than the recent gunfire. Tasha turned slowly, calmly meeting his glare. She blinked once, deliberately slow. "No," she said, her voice low but steady, refusing to rise to his bait. "I'm just here to shoot." Buck sneered, shaking his head, his face contorted. "Sure you are. Bet you think you're real hot stuff, 'cause you got lucky a few times." The accusation was ridiculous, flying in the face of the evidence still pinned downrange. But his anger wasn't rational. From the benches nearby, Roy, the heavy-set man in the orange vest, heaved himself up. He wiped his greasy hands deliberately on his jeans and walked over, his considerable bulk planting him firmly between Tasha and the agitated Buck. "Now, that didn't look like luck to me, Buck," Roy said, his voice calm but carrying undeniable authority. A few other men nearby mumbled low agreement. Buck ignored them, his focus entirely on Tasha, his body thrumming with barely contained aggression. He squared his shoulders, abruptly lifted his rifle, and fired a hasty, jerky shot downrange. It was sloppy, uncontrolled. The shot hit the paper, but wildly off-center, tearing the edge near the outer ring. A visual representation of his current state. Tasha said nothing. She didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. Roy shook his head, a sigh escaping him. He turned slightly, addressing Buck directly, but keeping his body positioned as a buffer. "Now look," he said, his tone reasonable but firm. "You want to get better? You watch people who know what they're doing. Ask questions maybe. You don't stand there tearing em down, cause your pride stung." Buck's jaw worked furiously, chewing on unspoken retorts. His eyes darted from Roy to Tasha, then back again. Finally, defeated but not conceding, he muttered something unintelligible under his breath, snatched up his rifle, and stomped back towards the benches, slamming the gun down hard enough to make others flinch. The tension, stretched taut like a rubber band, finally snapped, leaving a residue of awkward silence. Roy turned back to Tasha, the sternness leaving his face. He offered her a nod, and this time it wasn't the stiff, reluctant acknowledgement from before. This was genuine, earned respect. "You've earned that, ma'am," he said quietly. Then a touch louder. "You come back next weekend? We got a little club that meets up Saturday mornings. Marksmen only. Could use someone with your eye." Tasha hesitated. An invitation, not just tolerance, but an actual welcome into the fold. It was unexpected. Places like this, men like these. Her life experience had taught her that these doors often remained firmly shut, regardless of skill or qualification. But she saw something open and genuine in Roy's weathered face, and she recalled the subtle softening she'd noticed in some of the other men's expressions earlier. Not pity, but acknowledgement. "Maybe I will," she said, allowing a small, genuine smile to surface. "Thank you, Roy." Roy chuckled, his relief evident. "Good. We even got a barbecue after practice. You bring that aim of yours, I'll bring the smoked ribs." Easy laughter rolled across the firing line again. Warmer this time, inclusive. For the first time since stepping out of her car hours ago, Tasha felt the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach finally, fully loosen. Today hadn't been about showing off or beating anyone. It had been about standing her ground, inhabiting her own skin, knowing deep down she had nothing to prove to them. And yet, proving it anyway. Not with arguments or demands, but with quiet action, unwavering focus. She picked up her gear bag, slinging it over her shoulder. As she walked back towards the parking area, she caught a few more lingering looks. But the curiosity, skepticism, and mockery were gone, replaced now by something clear and unambiguous. Respect. Simple, hard-earned, undeniable. Loading her gear into the trunk of her car, the sun now dipping lower, painting the dusty sky in hues of orange and purple, Tasha reflected on the day. Judgment turns surprisingly quickly when confronted with undeniable competence, especially when that competence refuses to apologize for itself, refuses to shrink to fit preconceived notions. But just before she could drive away, one more unexpected encounter waited, ready to seal the lesson of the day in a way she hadn't anticipated. Tasha was wiping a film of range dust off her windshield with a crumpled paper towel when the crunch of gravel behind her made her turn. She half expected Roy, maybe with a final reminder about the barbecue, but it wasn't him. It was one of the younger guys, tall and lanky, probably mid-20s, the one who'd been with Buck's group earlier, his ball cap now worn straight, not cocked with bravado. He looked sheepish, uncomfortable, his hands jammed deep into his jeans pockets, shoulders hunched as if unsure of his welcome. Tasha kept her expression neutral, waiting. She wasn't going to make this easy, but she wasn't going to be hostile either. He stopped a few feet away, rocking awkwardly on his heels, avoiding her eyes. Hey, he mumbled, scratching the back of his neck. Name's Logan. Tasha simply nodded once. Tasha! He took a breath, finally looking up, meeting her gaze briefly before his eyes skittered away again. Look, I just wanted to say. His voice dropped lower, laced with genuine embarrassment. You're really good. Like, seriously good. Best damn shooting I think I've ever seen out here. Tasha crossed her arms lightly over her chest, still waiting. Thanks. Logan shuffled his feet, kicking aimlessly at a loose stone. And he added, his voice even quieter, forcing the words out. Sorry, if me and the guys were acting like jerks earlier. He risked a quick glance around the parking lot, as if hoping none of his former companions were close enough to witness this moment of contrition. Tasha held his gaze for a beat longer than comfortable, letting the apology land. She wasn't interested in extracting punishment. She wasn't even truly angry anymore. Mostly, she felt a profound weariness, but also a flicker of something else. Maybe it mattered that he came over. Maybe it mattered that he said it. It's easy to laugh when you don't know somebody, she said simply, her voice even. Harder when you actually have to look em in the eye afterwards. Logan nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. He seemed almost grateful she hadn't lectured him or made it harder. Yeah, I guess, he mumbled. Well, just thanks for showing up. And, for not being a jerk about it when you, He trailed off awkwardly. Tasha almost smiled. Almost. Wasn't here to show off, she repeated quietly. Just here to shoot. He gave a short, awkward laugh, nodded again, then backed away hastily, nearly stumbling over his own feet in his hurry to retreat to his own truck. Watching him go, Tasha felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. Not pride, not quite. Hope, maybe? A reminder that sometimes bridges could be built, even if they started with awkward apologies in dusty parking lots. Maybe these small, individual moments of connection mattered more than the grand, silent victories. She climbed into her car, the worn leather seat warm against her back from the afternoon sun. She sat for a moment, just breathing, watching Roy and a few others packing up across the lot. Roy caught her eye and lifted a hand in a short, definitive wave. Not casual, not dismissive, a real acknowledgement. She lifted her fingers slightly from the steering wheel in return, a silent acceptance. Pulling out slowly, the tires crunching over the loose gravel one last time, she turned onto the highway, the shooting range shrinking in her rearview mirror until it was just another dusty patch on the Texas horizon. Opinions change, sometimes slowly, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes only when confronted with undeniable truth delivered repeatedly, without apology. Respect wasn't demanded, it wasn't requested, it was built. One steady shot, one calm breath, one refusal to be diminished at a time, even when others were determined not to see. But the day wasn't quite over. There was still one more voice, one more echo from the range, waiting just down the road. A voice that would crystallize the meaning of the day long after the smell of gunpowder faded from her clothes. The fluorescent lights of the gas station convenience store just outside Pflugerville hummed, casting a sterile glow. Tasha parked by the pumps, letting the engine idle for a moment, the quiet thrum a counterpoint to the lingering adrenaline buzzing under her skin. The intensity of the range had drained her more than she realized. She needed a cold drink and a few minutes to simply be, before tackling the long drive home. Inside, the air conditioning was a welcome shock, cool and smelling faintly of stale coffee, sugary snacks, and a hint of motor oil. Tasha grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and headed to the counter. There was only one person ahead of her, a man in a faded flannel shirt, back turned, paying for a brown paper bag. She barely registered him until he turned, the bag tucked under his arm. It was Buck, the same wiry, resentful man who'd challenged her, who'd stomped away in anger. Standing less than 3 feet away, looking just as startled to see her as she was to see him. For a tense second, neither of them moved. The air thickened again, charged with unspoken history. Then Buck cleared his throat, the sound rough, awkward. He shifted the bag higher on his hip, avoiding her gaze. "Ah," he started, his voice low, hesitant. "Listen." Tasha remained silent, watchful, letting him navigate the uncomfortable space he'd largely created. Buck took off his dirty ball cap, running a hand through sweat-flattened hair. Close up, without the anger masking his features, his face looked different, tired-lined, less hard than she'd perceived from a distance. More worn down. He finally met her eyes briefly. You're real good," he said, the words coming out rough, like gravel tumbling, but devoid of the earlier sarcasm. It sounded like an admission torn from him against his will, but true nonetheless. Tasha gave a single slight nod. "Appreciate it." He hesitated again, his gaze dropping to the scuffed linoleum floor, then flicking back up. Shouldn't have come at you like that," he muttered, the words barely audible. "Back there. Wasn't right. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't a grand apology. It barely qualified as taking full responsibility." But Tasha recognized it for what it was. She knew enough about men like Buck, men whose pride was wrapped around them like protective armor, to understand that this mumbled admission was the apology. It was him laying down his weapon, the only way he knew how. She took a slow breath, let it out deliberately. "Sometimes," she said, her voice even, without accusation, "you got to see something different right in front of you to realize what you've been missing." Buck looked at her, really looked at her this time, for a long second. Then, he gave a single sharp nod. A real one. Acknowledgement. "Yeah," he said gruffly. "Yeah. Guess you're right." He shifted his bag again, turned abruptly, and pushed through the glass door, letting it swing shut behind him without another word. Tasha paid for her water, the transaction mundane, ordinary. Back in the heat of the parking lot, the asphalt shimmering, she sat behind the wheel for a minute, sipping the cold water, letting the silence settle. It would have been so easy to leave that range simmering with anger, to carry the bitterness home like a trophy of injustice. Easy to let Buck's final, grudging words mean nothing, but she didn't feel bitter. She felt steady, anchored. Today had been a reminder, sharp and clear, not just for them, but for her. People will judge. They'll measure you against their own limited experiences, their own biases, the shallowest parts of themselves. Sometimes, no matter how skilled, how calm, how undeniably good you are, they won't want to see it. They won't want to change. But changing them wasn't her job. Her job was to stand in her truth, to show up, to be steady, even when it was uncomfortable. Especially when it was uncomfortable. To be undeniable, not through volume, but through quiet, consistent reality. Tasha started the engine, the car rumbling to life. She pulled back onto the highway, the long stretch of Texas road unfolding before her under a sky slowly deepening towards night. She thought again of Mia and Jordan. Someday, inevitably, they would face their own moments of being underestimated, judged by assumptions before they even spoke a word. She hoped, fiercely, that in those moments, they wouldn't fight for approval or twist themselves out of shape seeking acceptance from those determined to withhold it. She hoped they'd remember their mother, hoped they'd remember to simply do what needed to be done, with steady hands and a steady heart. But before the day was truly done, before the memory settled into the past, Tasha had one more decision to make. A quiet promise to herself, one that could turn today's hard-won lesson into something more lasting, something like a legacy. The familiar silhouette of her small house in Taylor, Texas, came into view as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The porch light clicked on automatically, casting a warm, welcoming glow. Across the street, her neighbor's beagle offered a few lazy, half-hearted barks. The air was still thick with the day's accumulated heat, but the crushing intensity had eased into a slower, southern evening pace. Tasha sat in the driveway for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, just breathing. The events of the day replayed in her mind. The initial wave of smirks and whispers, the palpable weight of doubt, the sharp crack of the first shot slicing through it all. Then the slow, reluctant turn, the grudging nods, the awkward questions, the eventual, undeniable respect mirrored in strangers' eyes. It would be easy to dismiss it. A one-off experience. Just a few ignorant guys at a particular range on a particular Saturday. Forget it, move on. But Tasha knew, deep in her bones, it was more than that. Today wasn't just about marksmanship. It was a microcosm of a larger struggle. The daily act of standing firm against judgment, against small-mindedness, against the fear and assumptions that build invisible walls. It was about refusing to shrink, refusing to apologize for taking up space, for being skilled, for being present. It was about showing up, steady and sure, again and again, until the reality of who you are leaves no room for flimsy preconceptions. She thought again of Roy's invitation. The Saturday morning marksman club, the barbecue, the chance to return next weekend, not as an anomaly, not as the black woman who can shoot, but simply as Tasha, a respected peer, someone they expected to be good. She hadn't given Roy a definitive answer back at the range. She hadn't needed to then, but she knew the answer now. A small smile touched Tasha's lips as she finally climbed out of the car. The familiar press of gravel through the thin soles of her boots grounding her. Inside, the house was filled with the comfortable sounds of evening. Jordan was sprawled on the couch, lost in the world of his headphones, a half-eaten sandwich balanced precariously on the worn armrest. Mia sat at the kitchen table, head bent in concentration, her small fingers smudged with the bright, waxy colors of her crayons. They both looked up as she entered, their faces breaking into welcoming smiles. "Hey, Mama," Jordan mumbled, pulling one headphone off his ear. Mia grinned, holding up a drawing of a lopsided rainbow. "Did you win today, Mama?" Tasha laughed softly, the sound genuine and light, setting her keys and the now-empty water bottle on the counter. "Something like that, baby girl," she said. She walked over and ruffled Mia's hair, her heart swelling with a fierce, unexpected tenderness. Because this, right here, was the real target. Today hadn't truly been about impressing strangers or hitting bull's eyes at a dusty range outside Pflugerville. It was about them, about ensuring these two kids grew up knowing the strength, the resilience, the quiet dignity of their mother, hoping they might see reflections of that same steadiness within themselves when their time came. It was about laying down a foundation beneath their feet, a solid belief that you don't need anyone else's permission to belong. You don't have to fit into their narrow boxes. You just have to be willing to show up, authentically, consistently, and let your actions speak with undeniable clarity. She grabbed a glass from the cabinet, poured herself some iced tea from the pitcher in the fridge, and leaned back against the counter, letting the familiar comfort of home settle around her. Tomorrow, she'd call Roy. Tell him she'd be there next Saturday. And the Saturday after that. She would keep showing up, not because she still had something to prove. Today had settled that. But because she had something to live. Because every time you refuse to let prejudice write your narrative, every time you stand tall in your own truth and stay centered, you chip away at those invisible walls. You make it just a little bit easier, a little bit safer, for the next person who walks into that room, onto that range, into that space where they aren't expected. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real change begins. Not with loud declarations or angry protests, though sometimes those are necessary too. But often, it starts quietly, with steady hands, a steady heart, and the unwavering courage to simply be who you are, and pull the trigger when it counts.